Hey listeners, this is Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and you're listening to episode 48 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is The We Passages of Acts. Throughout the Acts of the Apostles, the narrator routinely uses the third person when describing the speeches and actions of individuals or groups within the story. This was the author's style in the Gospel of Luke. It's the style of the other Gospels. And, as important background to all, it's what we find in the historical texts of the Hebrew Bible: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and so on. As we move chapter by chapter in Acts, this is the consistent mode of writing that we find. That is, until we reach chapter 16, where, in verse 10, we read from the NRSV, "We set sail from Troas." This is the first of the so-called we passages found in the second half of the book of Acts. But what do they mean? On the face of it, it seems pretty obvious. The narrator is detailing for his readers where he himself enters the narrative, traveling with Paul and his entourage. So, he's on the boat with them as they travel to Philippi in verses 11 through 13. He's there when they meet Lydia in verses 14 and 15. He's there when they encounter a spirit-possessed girl in verses 16 through 18. He's present when Paul's companions travel from Philippi to Troas to meet him there in chapter 20, verses 5 and 6. He's there during Paul's journey to Jerusalem in chapter 21, verses 1 through 18. And he's with Paul as he has an adventure, going to Rome, facing a tempest, enduring a shipwreck, and ultimately arriving in the capital of the empire in chapter 27, verse 1, to chapter 28, verse 16. This understanding of the we passages has a lot going for it. For starters, it seems like a natural way of reading the text. Why else would you suddenly interject the first person plural if you weren't trying to say you were there? Moreover, in the dedication to Theophilus found in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, the author says that he wished to write down an account of the events that have been fulfilled among us. Wouldn't the journeys in Acts count as part of that? It should also be noted that the we passages were taken by earlier interpreters of the Acts of the Apostles to be indicative of the author's presence. For example, the church father Irenaeus wrote that Luke was inseparable from Paul. Noting the places in Acts where the first person plural is employed, he then says that Luke was present at all these occurrences and carefully noted them down in writing. As popular as this interpretation of the we passages is, especially among many Christians, is this the only way to read these texts? No, it isn't. One alternative way of understanding the we passages is to see them as sources from which the author of Acts drew. In his shorter commentary on Acts, C.K. Barrett contends that Acts could not have been written by an eyewitness like Luke. There are too many discrepancies between Paul's letters and what we find in Acts. It is difficult to believe that all parts of the book were written by an intimate companion and fellow traveler of Paul's, he writes. But Barrett thinks that it is possible that someone who was a colleague of Paul, perhaps even Luke, stands behind some of the source material upon which the author based his narrative. The first person plural is then an artifact derived from this source. Another way of reading the we passages comes from William Sanger Campbell's monograph, The We Passages in the Acts of the Apostles, the Narrator as Narrative Character, published in 2007. In short, Campbell thinks that the we character is meant to be an authenticating witness for the Apostle Paul, one who essentially replaces Barnabas. Barnabas, he notes, traveled with Paul and essentially vouched for him. Paul had been a violent persecutor of the church, but now he was perhaps its most famous acolyte. But this reversal of positions gives him, in the words of Campbell, a credibility problem, making Paul suspect, and so Barnabas acts as an authenticating witness to bolster Paul's seemingly incredible testimony. But at the end of chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas part ways, leaving Paul exposed. That's when, in the very next chapter, the we character steps in. He replaces Barnabas, and in the we passages, he acts as a major influence in the expansion of Paul's mission, serves as an observer of a variety of events wherein Paul is hindered from reaching Jerusalem, and is present as Paul makes his way by sea to Rome. For Campbell, then, the we passages are meant to authenticate Paul, not reveal that the author of Acts was a companion of him. Another take on the we passages comes from Michael Parsons in his commentary on Acts. He writes that nailing down the actual source of the first person in these narratives has proven intractable and unsolvable. But then he looks at them from another light. What is their rhetorical function? He writes, "From the ancients' point of view, this kind of eyewitness testimony, autopsia, was an indispensable ingredient to gaining information about the past, even preferable to written sources and oral tradition. In the we passages, Luke combines references to all three: written sources, primarily the Old Testament but also letters, oral tradition, possibly including speeches, and eyewitness testimony. In this way, Parson contends, Luke has added an air of authority to the stories, whether or not, in fact, such authority had any real basis." These examples aren't the only ways to read and understand the we passages, but I hope that it shows that the issue isn't as simple as, Luke said it, I believe it. Rather, we have to consider not only what is written, but, as much as possible, how it was written and why. And that takes a little more than a cursory reading of the Book of Acts. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time. And remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for listening.